Hello, BookTube. Well, it's a bleak and barren Sunday once again. For those of you who are new to the channel, that's the worst day of the week. That's the day of the week when there is no free mail for Steve, no books for me to unwrap and show to the rest of you and then roll around in on the floor. And as usual, I'm consoling myself with a tag. And I found a neat one. It's the Get to Know You book tag. And it's just a dozen questions outlining, your bookish self, which is, I think it'll be, that bookish self is probably very familiar to quite a few by now, but I keep noticing that the subscriber count goes up, not fast, but steadily. So there'll be a bunch of you who might not have prowled through 500 previous videos to find out all the tedium there is to know about me. So I thought we'd go through it. Starting with question number one, the most basic one of all: what is your favorite book? And I've mentioned this on this channel before. It's Ovid's Metamorphoses. Question number two: what was your favorite book 5 years ago? Revealing, as so many of these tag questions do in the months that I've been doing them, the age demographic of the person who created the tag. I am 2,903 years old. My favorite book 5 years ago was Ovid's Metamorphoses. Question number three: what's your favorite trilogy or series? It's tough to pick just one. Of course, when you talk trilogy or series, you're talking fantasy and science fiction almost always. And if we're talking fantasy or science fiction, probably my number one spot would go to one that isn't continued. It stopped. And it's something I think I've mentioned on this channel before. It's the Journeys of McGill Fayen by Kevin O'Donnell, who wrote them 30 years ago. And I think there were only 4 books. It was clearly meant you could read the books and see he meant it to just go on and on, but book contracts change, people die, people move on, and it didn't continue, and it's never been collected in one volume. That would be awesome, because my little ratty mass market paperbacks are ready to fall apart. They concern the character McGill Fayen, who is a young man who is in Earth's slight future a flinger, a rare race of people who have genetic ability to teleport both themselves and a discrete amount of weight without traveling the intervening distance. And O'Donnell lays it all out perfectly, and they're so good, and they're so funny, and they're so bitingly intelligent that I reread them periodically, although now I have to be fairly gingerly about it, because I don't find the mass market paperbacks used anymore. That's just an asymptotic progression. The longer you wait, the fewer mass market copies you will find of anything. And I don't, like I said, I don't think it's ever going to be reprinted. It's a shame, but I don't think it'll ever happen. So I have to sort of rely on my memory of McGill Fayen rather than reread the books, which is a shame. In terms of non-science fiction and fantasy, my favorite series would probably be the Aubrey and Maturin books by Patrick O'Brien. Napoleonic era seafaring fiction that takes a bit of getting used to, but if you haven't tried it, you really should, because they are singularly satisfying once you get the hang of the lingo. Question number 4: what was the last book you read? I just finished it. It's Timothy Bolton's Canute the Great, his biography of King Canute for the Yale English Monarch series, about the Scandinavian king who conquered England a generation before the Norman conquest. And it was wonderful. Bolton takes all of the usual thumbnail shorthand about King Canute and throws it all out the window and decides to consult an enormous number of primary sources and just see where they lead him, which is the perfect thing you want to do in a biography. Okay, I know the story, I know all the folklore. Now I want to know what can I actually tell you about this guy. And as a result, the portrait of King Canute is completely different than anyone that I've ever read. We get a sophisticated internationalist in place of just a sort of complacent freebooter. And also a forward thinker. It's a very sympathetic biography, but I think fairly accurate as far as I could tell. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I wouldn't be surprised. It's a little early to tell, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's on my list of the 10 best biographies I read this year. So that was the last one I read. I just finished it just before I made this tag. Question number 5. What was the last book of poetry you read? We saw it on this channel. Norton has made a facsimile reprint of The Wild Swans at Cooley by William Butler Yeats. His universally praised 1919 volume of poetry. I got a beautiful reprint copy and read it right away and paused over it. Really, there's a thing I have to do with poetry collections that I don't usually do with anything else. Because if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that I am in a neck to neck death grapple with the publishing industry. I am trying my hardest to keep my head above water. It's impossible, but I'm trying my hardest to do it. I want to be one of the tiny handful of people who manages to keep their head above water in terms of new releases. It's never going to happen. But it does mean that I have a tendency to charge into a book. To, as James Boswell said about Samuel Johnson, to read the guts out of it. I have a tendency to do that. And I don't mind. I don't believe that it's lessening my enjoyment at all. Certainly, because for instance, I read King Canute in a little more than an hour, and I loved it. Absolutely loved it. And I am responsible for it. I'm hoping to review it, and I know its details. It's not like I missed anything because I read it that fast. But when it comes to poetry and also children's picture books, I slow way down. I intentionally rattle back that urge to grapple with new releases in order to get them off the docket and get on to the next one. I intentionally don't do that when it comes to poetry or children's picture books. I slow down and take my time and savor. And some of you might say I should do that with everything. And, to that I respond with, when I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. Okay? I'm not going to slow down and savor so at the end of March I can put on pants, get in front of a camera and say, oh yeah, well, March was a good month. I read 15 books. I'd rather die. But I do slow down with those, and I did slow down with The Wild Swans of Cooley and loved it more than I've ever loved reading it in the past. Yeah, I don't know where the fight picking came from. We'll just say the fight picking came from South Boston, along with the predilection for potatoes and griping. Let's see here. Question number 6. What book most influenced your life? I'm going to cheat a little because I have it in one book, of course. I'm going to say Shakespeare. I've thought about this question a lot, and I honestly can't, in faith, give that answer to anything else. Shakespeare is the book that comes closest to it having most changed my life. Just in the way that you see yourself differently. The way that he shows you yourself. It's hard to put into words. It might explain why, comparatively speaking, just in terms of word count, I have written so little about Shakespeare in my life, as opposed to lots of other things that have affected me less. But I think I'm going to give the prize to, especially since it's on my mind, because just the other day at a thrift shop I found a really nice looking 1-volume collected Shakespeare that is, because it's double columned, it's just the size of a normal book. It has a dust jacket with his face on it, and it has neat old 19th century illustrations. I found it for 50 cents. So it feels like a book. It feels like a book instead of a collection of plays. So I'm going to say Shakespeare. Let's see here. Where are we here? Question number 7. A book that made you ugly cry. We've covered this before on this channel, BookTube. I save my ugly crying for the things that deserve it. And I can't help but think that the only reason why so many BookTube questions ask what YA fantasy novel volume 4 in a series made you ugly cry, I can't help but think that the reason why that question crops up so often is, again, because these tags are made by young people, where the waterworks are a little more ready. Young people who have, I might venture to generalize, never experienced loss. Once that starts to happen, much less when it starts to pile up like the snows of yesteryear, I think you'll find that you ugly cry less at fiction. I could be wrong. If you don't, if you stay that emotionally open to everything, maybe that's a strength. Maybe I should be envying you. But it certainly doesn't happen to me. So I don't have an answer to this question. Question number 8. A book that made you laugh. Just the other day I reread a chunk of a book that it isn't typically thought of as a comedy, The Last Hurrah by Edwin O'Connor, one of the great political novels of American literature, about a wily old Boston politician. Boston is never named in the book, but the city is fairly obviously Boston. A wily old politician who's trying to get reelected one more time. And the novel is full of chapter-long set pieces, and one of them is called The Wake of Naco Minahan. If any of you have read the book, you will immediately be smiling because you will remember that section, and it is a comic masterpiece. So I thought about it, especially since I just reread the book, so I have it fresh in mind. Let's see here. Question number 9: character you'd like to be for a day. Again, we have encountered this on this channel before. There isn't any, and you know why? Because every single character in a book shares one thing in common. They're all characters in a book. They can't move around on their own. They don't act unless you're looking at them. They are the little man who turns on the light in the refrigerator. They don't have an existence. I wouldn't want to be one. If you're saying, well, you're not getting into the spirit of the question, you mean you want to live in that world, I submit to you that if it were an actual question of going and living in a world, in a fictional world, this of course means fiction, not nonfiction. If it were an actual question of doing that, you would see what I'm talking about. You would see the drastic limitations of fiction in terms of describing something that you could actually step into and live. You wouldn't do it. You would refuse if it came to this, if you actually saw the question clear. So, which is a long way of saying I don't have an answer. So we'll just move on. Let's see here. Question number 10. A book that was so good you dreamed about it. This took me a while to remember. The one thing that I remember ages and ages ago when I first read it was Frank Herbert's Dune, his science fiction masterpiece, Dune, about the desert planet Arrakis, where this giant sandworms roam. And for a long time after I read that book, I thought about water conservation, which I had not thought about before. Growing up on, a steady stream of water. You grow up in America, you have no water problems at all, unlike the rest of the world, especially not the rest of the world now. I never even thought about it. One reason or another, I never even thought about it. And after I read that book, I did think about it quite a bit, how water is precious on Dune. And I believe I had a couple of dreams in which extreme water rationing was the norm, and little did I think 50 years ago that so many parts of the world would reach that would become a reality for so many parts of the world. Women in villages in Africa walking for 20 miles one way with a gigantic jug on their head just to stand in line in the burning sun for a jug full of water. And that's it. That's all they've got until they make the next trip the next day. It's a reality that's unthinkable for most of the developed world, and yet every article that I read, every study that I read online shows that it's going to be more and more of a problem. Potable water is going to be more and more of a problem, especially if, in America, if now that the Republicans are in complete control of the government, fracking is the totally fraudulent and horrible, economically horrific practice known as fracking is going to become common, even on public land, even on nature preserves. And one of the things that fracking does is to contaminate groundwater, including aquifers that are hundreds of thousands of years old. You contaminate enough of those, and you'll learn pretty quick how precious drinking water is. One way or another. Back when I read Dune, those weren't active questions. No one thought about them, so it made a strong impression. Let's see here. Question number 11. A book you DNF'd. That just did happen recently. It was last week. Oh, what was it? It was a thriller. And the main character had a drinking problem that the author clearly thought her drinking problem was cool, but the way her drinking problem was described in the book would have got her booted from any police force anywhere in the world. Right away. We wouldn't have been reading about her adventures. And the adventures themselves, I got to page, I think, maybe 50, 55, something like that, and a gigantic plot hole opened up, and I was thinking, well, okay, is there an outside chance here that the author knows this and is manipulating the reader? And then I got maybe a page more, 2 pages more, and realized, no, you just don't realize that you're not very good at this, and you didn't get edited, because lots of major publishing houses don't have the budget for it anymore. They'll run it through a spell check on a computer, but a lot of especially low level genre fiction doesn't have a caring, concerned editor sitting on it until it's line perfect. At least I assume that, because I read a lot of these things in which there are not only typos but glaring plot holes, and I seem to remember decades ago that was not the case. I distinctly remember 35 years ago, if I'd come across a book that was structured as poorly as the one that I just DNF'd, I don't remember its name. Isn't that terrible? I'll find it. I'll find out what the name is. But if 35 years ago, if I had read a book that was structured as poorly as that, the number one question on my mind would have been, how on earth did this get published? And things have gotten so bad that I don't think that anymore. I read them and think, another one of these. Very bad. And, I might add, just as a parenthetical, as this is a bit of a ranty tag anyway, that if mainstream publishing is going to allow that to happen, then mainstream publishing can't complain when indie publishing starts to come up from behind. I know now probably 3 dozen indie publishers who wouldn't allow that to happen. They pay for beta readers too. They also pay for freelance editors. They're scrupulous about every line, about every word. I know some of them that obsess over typos, little typos. They put, in other words, the kind of care into the preparation of their manuscript that a lot of mainstream publishers don't do anymore. So the mainstream publishers can't complain when on Amazon and elsewhere readers are saying, I read your book and it was disappointing just on a structural level. And then I read so-and-so's book who's published it himself and is getting every penny of those royalties, going back into something that's totally transparent. It's not going for billboards or radio time or anything like that. I read that book and it was perfectly satisfying with no irritating mistakes. So I'm going to go with that route, not you anymore. Mainstream publishers really can't complain about that if they're not going to maintain a level of quality that was once upon a time one of their main selling points. So anyway, let's see here. Question number 12. The book you are most excited to see. Since this is a tag on BookTube, I'm assuming fiction is meant, but I'm going to give fiction and nonfiction, if that's all right. The fiction is by Kevin Hearn, who some of you might know. He wrote the Iron Druid Chronicles, about a centuries-old super haughty druid and his pet wolfhound, who it was sort of a Jim Butcher-esque thing. The Dresden Files was sort of like that, sort of a druid for hire, the easiest, least common denominator humor, the very simple plots, sort of a you're supposed to sort of be the pal of the main character. And I liked the series just fine. I was very happy for him when he started getting hardcover deals out of it. That's fine. He's a good writer, so you want somebody to progress like that. But he has a new book coming out, I think in the fall, called A Plague of Giants. It's not part of the Iron Druid series. It's the beginning of a new series, and it seems intriguing to me. So I'm looking forward to that. And when it comes to nonfiction, I am looking for the next chamber in an ongoing game of Russian roulette. It's Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses S. Grant. It also comes out in the fall. Big brick of a thing. And I don't know where it's going to land. I really don't. Ron Chernow's last book, his biography of George Washington, was absolutely awful. And not just bad, but willfully, intentionally mendacious. It was full of lies. It wasn't just full of mistakes. He's too good a historian for that. It was full of lies. And it drove me nuts that such a reputable, big-name biographer could make such a thing. But the book before that was his biography of Alexander Hamilton, which I and everyone else in the world justly loved. So, so now I don't know. The Grant book, for me, will prove one thing or another. It will either prove that when it came to Washington, Chernow was just as vulnerable to hagiography as so many other writers who have ever written about the founding moron of America, or it will prove that Ron Chernow has started to read his own notices and cannot write responsible biography anymore. Either Washington was an aberration, or it was the beginning of a new pattern. I will see when Grant comes out. I will know one way or another, and I will tell the world. Well, the tiny bit of the world that I have access to, I will beg and plead to review it for the Christian Science Monitor, and I will also talk about it here. So there you go, and it will feature one way or another on my intergalactically famous book blog, Steve Reads, during my rambunctious end of the year roundup. But anyway, that's nonfiction and fiction there for you. And and that's it. That is the end of the Get to Know You book tag, and it did cheer me up. So on this bleak and barren Sunday, so I have you to thank for that. So thank you, BookTube. I'll see you soon.